Good evening and welcome to this evening's discussion of Mere Economics, Lessons to and from the Ordinary Business of Life. My name is Mary Thoreau, and I'm Chairman and CEO of the Independent Institute. Unfortunately, Phil Magnus, who was to be with us this evening, is ill, and we are grateful to Graham Walker for stepping in. Independent is a nonpartisan public policy research and educational organization that commissions in-depth studies into the causes of seemingly intractable challenges, and very importantly, tasks our fellows with developing demonstrated solutions. Nonpartisan and non-politicized, we regularly offer our peer-reviewed research to policymakers across the aisle, but our main endeavor is to inform those most concerned with the issues we undertake, whether they be education, homelessness, healthcare, or myriad others, with alternative solutions that might otherwise never have been thought of. Independent Institute was founded by my late husband, David Thoreau, who had a deep appreciation for the topics to be explored tonight. David grounded Independent's work in the tenets of natural law and the principles of economics first developed by the Christian Spanish scholastics, which formed the basis of the subsequent Austrian School of Economics. The title of tonight's book, Mere Economics, is of course a play on C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. And David also founded the C.S. Lewis Society of California. There's a flyer for which in your packets. He did so because he saw a need to reestablish to today's culture the link between Christian moral truths and liberty, which Lewis's works do brilliantly. Through this outreach, he helped to make Christians aware of the liberty-affirming political and economic implications of Christ's teachings and to introduce secular libertarians and free market economists to their Christian roots. Independent's mission affirms these ideals. It's to boldly advance peaceful, prosperous, and free societies grounded in a commitment to human worth and dignity. Tonight's conversation is thus especially topical for us, rescuing economics from the utilitarian positive science it has widely become to return it to its marriage with ethics. Following the Spanish scholastics, the acknowledged father of modern economics is Adam Smith, who is a moral philosopher. His more well-known work, The Wealth of Nations, cannot be fully appreciated or understood without its companion in ethics, the theory of moral sentiments. You're in for a real treat tonight. Art Carden makes economics lively, fun, and relevant. In Mere Economics, he and his co-author, independent research fellow Caleb Fuller, lay out clearly how economics not only accords with loving our neighbor, but how the market rewards and thus incents our loving our neighbor. Indeed, in a free market, you can truly only do well by satisfying the needs and wants of others. Art Carden is a research fellow at Independent Institute and Margaret Gage Bush Distinguished Professor of Economics at Stanford University in Birmingham, Alabama. He is a co-editor of the Southern Economic Journal and a fellow with numerous research, education, and outreach institutions. He's also the co-author of Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich: How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World. Graham Walker is president of the Independent Institute, and many of you will know him from our podcast, Independent Outlook. He's also president of the C.S. Lewis Society. He earned a PhD in law and political theory from the University of Notre Dame and has degrees in international security studies and history. He's the author of the books Moral Foundations of Constitutional Thought and The Ethics of F.A. Hayek, and it is the editor of a forthcoming volume of the collected essays of David Thoreau on C.S. Lewis. Following Graham and Art's discussion, we'll open up to questions with all of you. Graham and Art?
Thank you so much, Mary. A wonderful thumbnail sketch of the history of economic freedom and its antecedents. So Art, as you can see, is just going from what's in his brain. I have to have notes. So my first note is Here's Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Here's Mere Economics by Art Carden and Caleb Fuller. Clearly, the one must have been in your mind with the other. People say about C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity that he emphasizes or articulates the things that pretty much all Christians held in common. Does that mean that Mere Economics kind of articulates the things that all economics have in common? Economists have in common?
Yeah. So that's something we try to do. Is we try not to get cute. We try not to get fancy. We try to help the reader understand. So help economists, help theologians, help anybody who reads it understand the basic things that every economist believes and knows. By God, comparative advantage is a thing. Demand curve slope downward, supply curve slope upward. There's actually a really great article in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was either today or yesterday, by Brian Albrecht, explaining that the laws of supply and demand do an enormous amount of heavy lifting. And I think I was saying earlier, I was talking with, Ninos Malik, who's in the audience today. We were talking over lunch, and it's easy to lose sight as economists of the fact that economists' disagreements are kind of like here. So it's like, here's the left of the economics profession, here's the right of the economics profession. But you have the economics profession here, here's the rest of the world. Economists disagree about, okay, to what extent do we need to use the government to get the prices right? Whereas the rest of the world just rejects prices outright. So we're really trying to understand how far can the basics take us, and in particular in light of our own Christian worldviews.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, you're also bringing to bear, as you say, your own Christian worldview or the insights of Christian theology. Here's a metaphor. Does this metaphor work for you? The metaphor in my mind is that there's the pure moral light coming from the natural law and maybe ultimately from God. And then it's refracted through a prism. And if you've got a good prism, it refracts it nicely and illuminates, what's below it. But if your prism is messed up, it doesn't refract the light very well. Good economics seems to be like a good prism.
That's a very, very good way to put it, I think. And I'm going to make hold on just a second. So, hey, Siri, add a task to OmniFocus. Okay.
He's got a new metaphor.
What do you want to be reminded?
He likes it.
Use Graham Walker's prism metaphor for the second edition of Mere Economics.
Okay.
All right, there we go. Yeah, so, no, I think you're exactly right. You're exactly right because because one of the cool things about economics and exchange and whatnot is it produces these magical numbers called prices that aggregate all of this knowledge dispersed among many, many billions of people, and that allow us to use knowledge we don't have for purposes that other people may not approve of, and purposes that other people certainly don't know about. So the prism metaphor, I think, is really, really good. It all comes into high relief.
That's the idea.
Yeah. When you apply the economic way of thinking, and then when you understand all the implications of people responding to incentives, you can then see, and physics was a long time ago, so forgive me if I'm butchering any of this. You can see sort of the light in all of its beauty, its unity, and its diversity.
I noticed in the introduction that you made a reference to a book published in 1977 by Ron Sider.
Yeah.
Now, probably most of the people in our crowd tonight don't remember that. They're too young to remember it. But I have a very distinct memory. The reason this is important is because Ron Sider's book was called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. And Sider was a theologian, but presuming to write essentially on economic matters. And his book made such a splash during that time when many Christians were waking up to think about the world in public terms. And he told them basically that socialism is what the gospel calls for.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I was glad to see you mention that. And your book is like the wonderful antidote to Ron Sider. I have a memory of Ron Sider.
I hope it sells as many copies.
I hope it does. He sold a lot of copies. He really did. And in fact, in 1978, he took his team of helpers or theologians, whatever, on a tour of the country. And they called it Ron Sider's Discipleship Workshop. And in 1978, I was on a college campus back east as a student. very young student. And he came through, and I actually went in my files today and I found this was the campus newspaper. Sider challenges status quo and receives varied response. And this is the young Ron Sider as he looked back in 19.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And what was striking about that, here's what Ron Sider was telling that group that I was in as a student in 1978. It was called Discipleship Workshop. And it was all about how you really need to be a real, sincere, devoted disciple of Jesus Christ. And in order to do that, he had a handout, which I kept because it was so striking. The handout said that if you want to be a deeply committed follower of Christ and take up your cross, then you needed to explore actions of revolutionary leaders like Che Guevara. You needed to create new economic systems, and you needed to renounce American citizenship to declare yourself a citizen of the world. And this was the message that was being promoted in pretty heavy-duty Christian circles back in the late 1970s. How did you stumble upon Sider's book, and what did you think when you first read his argument?
Well, so first of all, the argument made him a very rich Christian, which is presumably a big part of and maybe an unintended consequence. I didn't know about the handout saying study Che Guevara, but that is sort of one of the classics in public economics and theology kind of stuff, saying everybody should be a socialist, and if we're not socialists, then we're horrible and awful and not actually following Jesus. I'm one of my holy discontents, or I guess one of my crusades in life, is for people to stop giving themselves credit for meaning well. Okay, Che Guevara was a monster. I mean, he looked cool. He wore a cool hat, and I guess the T-shirts are neat. But he killed thousands and thousands of people. Studying revolutionary leaders like him, or any of a lot of leaders in post-colonial Africa, or Mao, or Stalin, or
cared about the poor, Art.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think they did. I am not sure that anyone who is really very successful politically, and this includes revolutionaries, has a worldview any more sophisticated than their own love of power and wealth. At the same time, though, you don't have to be a monster in order to do monstrous things. Right. This is part of the message of mere economics is unintended consequences are everywhere. And if we think about something like Mao probably was a monster, Stalin certainly was a monster, Hitler was a monster. Even if they were angelic beings who wanted nothing but the best for the world, they still would have created famine. They still would have created systems of oppression, because it's impossible for people to calculate rationally, for people to figure out what to produce, how to produce it, where, when, and why.
For millions and millions of people.
For millions of people without market prices.
Right. And the substitute for market prices is coercion.
Yeah. It's the authority from the center. So the economist Don Lavoie put it this way in the 1980s when he said the problem of socialist planning without prices is not that people will be insufficiently motivated to do the right thing. It's that they won't know what the right thing is. And that's part of the message of basic, mere economics. When we dig into supply and demand analysis and talk about what prices are for and where they're from and how they're formed, they help us figure out what the right thing is. I'm going to put scare quotes around right thing there, because another one of the points that we try to make repeatedly, which has escaped at least one reviewer, is that profits are informative, but they're not decisive. So, and that again is a line I use with my students. It's a line that appears in the book repeatedly. Profits are informative, but not decisive. Pornhub makes a lot of money. But that does not mean that they're doing something righteous, or they're doing something good, or they're doing something
doing something
emulated,
wanted.
They're doing something wanted. Yes, and just because it's wanted and will generate revenue well in excess of cost doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing to be doing.
Well, back in 1978, Ron Sider, he was very clear about what the right thing was, because again, God was on the side of the poor. And this was back in the same time as the liberation theology was being promoted in Catholic circles, that there needs to be a preferential option for the poor and so forth. He was pretty clear on that at the time. But I think that you are a very fair-minded writer in this book. You give Sider his due because he kind of came around. Yeah. We better mention that since I've been criticizing him. Right. You better explain what he did later.
Yeah, he did come around and say, okay, yeah, so markets and democracy are okay. So basically, he became sort of, I don't want communism, I don't want socialism, I want us to be Sweden. That was sort of his approach, is he wanted us to be one of the Nordic states and basically capitalism with a giant welfare state. And maybe there's an argument to be made for that.
And he did disavow the position he had articulated in Rich Christians in an Age of Fire. Yeah, and there was a 20th anniversary edition of it and so forth. So I'm just trying to be fair to Ron Sider since I was criticizing Ron Sider. Yeah. But let me just go somewhere else. I brought my Bible with me.
Okay.
So I'm turning to the New Testament.
Okay. What translation?
This is the King James Version.
Ooh, okay.
So it's pretty much the same regard.
Classy. All right.
Yeah, exactly. So you addressed this in your book. Okay. I'm in Acts chapter 2.
Okay.
Okay. And it said about the time of the apostles in Acts chapter 2, all that believed were together and had all things common and sold their possessions and goods and parted them to all men as every man had need.
Ah, yes.
So Art, don't you love the Bible? Are you against the Bible? The Bible says that true Christians just have everything in common, and they give to everyone as they have need, and they sell their stuff, and they don't hold on to it.
Who'd they sell their stuff to?
Well, that was the interesting question.
And in exchange for what?
Right.
And who then has rights over what have you?
But isn't this Bible socialism?
So that's an interesting point, or it's an interesting question, and I think it describes community. And again, the way that we put this, the way I talk about it in classes and things like that, is that a family is fundamentally a small communist enterprise. Like my family operates according to the principle from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. That does not scale up to a society of strangers where people have different values and people don't necessarily know one another. And importantly, where people don't have the intimate local knowledge of what makes the people closest to them tick.
And when you formed your family, how much coercion did you deploy to make the family happen?
Well, none. Yeah, and ideally, there's not much coercion within the family.
Well, children are not adults.
They're not. And we fortunately, we've tried to teach our children to make good choices, but they make a lot of low stakes bad ones, which has been, oh dear God, it's been torture. But at the ages of 17, 15, and 13, they're pretty good kids. So
glad to hear it.
But
your point being that a collective, I don't know whether we need to call it a communist society, but it certainly is a collective common, is healthy when it's natural, but incredibly unhealthy when it's unnatural and coerced.
Right. So this is a point that I don't think we described this in the book, but Walter Williams, the great economist who I think taught Ninos and a bunch of other people in inner circles, said his problem with communists wasn't that they wanted to be communists, is they insisted that he be a communist as well.
Right.
So you can't have capitalism within a communist society. You can have communism within a capitalist society for people who want to do that sort of thing.
So, for example, there's a section in your book where you say there's nothing wrong with people forming cooperatives and communes.
Nothing wrong with it at all. Nothing wrong with it at all. That's what you want to try.
Called for because people could voluntarily associate.
Right. Yeah. And any small group of people doing anything together is like that. The Kiwanis Club or C.S. Lewis Society of California, or people coming together to watch a football game or anything like that, is people coming together for some common purpose that may not necessarily be price mediated. But when we invite people, so they're the major religion in Alabama is college football, and the two major denominations being Alabama and Auburn. So the high holy season starts in a few weeks, and when people invite folks over to watch football, there are some understandings, like maybe you bring some Swedish meatballs or you bring some snacks or something like that. But it's rare that anyone says, okay, yeah, you can come over and watch the game at my house for $5. The thing that Friedrich Hayek pointed out, and I think he's right here, is that what what makes these small communes and collectives, families and communities work well doesn't scale up.
Mm-hmm.
And the norms and rules that make an extended order, a commercial society work, don't work well in a family. So again, look, I'm not going to present my kids with a bill on their 18th birthday saying, here's how much we spent on food. Here's how much we spent on diapers,
I grew up in Berkeley, and my parents are members of the Berkeley Co-op.
Oh, okay.
Which I don't think exists now, but it was a great natural food thing. And they ran it really well back in those days. I used to love to go there with my mother. But everybody who was associated with that co-op, as I learned over the years, wanted that same model to be applied to society as a whole. Mm-hmm. And I didn't understand why they thought that their wonderful local thing had to be universalized.
Right. But that raises a really interesting point is you can experiment with that. So a lot of times socialists will talk about how worker-owned firms are so much better than the alternatives. Well, there's nothing that is stopping people from opening or starting worker-owned firms or worker-owned cooperatives to start to.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, if it works so well, then they should be able to eat Walmart's lunch.
They should be able to, but they don't.
Yeah. So I wrote a piece for AIER on like how to socialize the means of production, and it basically says, if you're the faculty union at universities or whatever, pool your money, buy a small oil company, use all of the profits because oil companies just produce profits by magic, then use the profits to buy another oil company, then another oil company, another oil company, and then you buy everything out eventually, and presto, the means of production have been socialized. The fact that people aren't doing that, though, suggests to me that there's something a little bit more complicated at stake.
Socialized. That's an interesting term, socialize. People often, who advocate socialism, they often talk about socialization of the means of production. But actually what it really means in practice is governmental takeover and control of the means of production. Do you know, I just was looking at a news report that I recalled from a year ago. Do you know that a year ago this month, Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, who was at that time, of course, the vice presidential candidate, he went on this online program. They called it White Dudes for Harris. That was the name of the program.
Oh, yes, okay.
And on White Dudes for Harris, Tim Walz said, one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. Is there anything wrong with that idea, Art?
Yes, there is, because neighborliness is not something that tends to happen at the point of a gun. And that's something that needs to be made very, very clear when we're talking about having governments do things, because the difference between a government and a firm is that a government can shoot you or lock you in a cage. And when people want to socialize the means of production, that's not going to happen without the threat of violence, without a gun under the table. Neighborliness is, and for those of you who've had children, you might have just seen these like fascinating little kind of economies that emerge where like the box of baby clothes passes to like whoever has the next kid. And it's incredible. It's so incredible to see how these things work. But that doesn't happen at gunpoint. That's neighborliness. When it's happening at gunpoint, it's tyranny. And importantly, one of the things that I think we really want to drive home in this book is that does not respect the human person as an entity that bears the image of God. It puts the person with the gun in their hand on the throne and says, okay, I'm going to be the one who gets to decide who lives and who dies. I'm going to decide who does what. And I am going to rule you as if you are, as if you're a wayward child, or I'm going to treat you like a pet. And it does not, I think, it doesn't respect people.
But Art, to be fair, the gun is usually hidden.
Yes. Yeah, the gun's hidden, and we want to make it clear that the gun, even though it's hidden, is still there.
Yeah, that's your point.
Yes, yeah.
One thing I'd like to do in this conversation is that in the course of the book, you give a series of interesting examples, like concrete policy issues, where what people say is the Christian or theologically inspired point of view actually has different consequences from what people think it will have. And so it flips a lot of things on their head. As an example of that, you mentioned at one point that if we want to really care about and benefit lower income and lower skilled workers, that it would follow, based upon the findings of economics, to avoid instituting minimum wage laws.
Right.
Now, that sounds terrible, because I thought that if we loved, low-skilled people, we want to raise their income by jacking up the minimum wage by law. Why are you saying the opposite? And does God really approve of your doing that?
Yes, God does approve of us doing this. One of the things that we do in the book is because we try to keep it short, and there are enormous bodies of literature on everything that we claim, and so it has on its like 400 footnotes, like directing people to the academic. If you want to look in the academic sausage factory and see where all this stuff comes from. The minimum wage is a very hotly contested topic, but again, economists agree for the most part that demand curve slope downward. And even economists who say that, yes, we should have a higher minimum wage, acknowledge that there's a disemployment effect. They just don't think it's big enough to really worry that much about. You mentioned earlier the preferential option for the poor, and one of the reasons I love capitalism is because it is the preferential option for the poor. Mm-hmm. In the case of the minimum wage, when you increase the price of something, people demand less of it, and that includes labor. Mm-hmm. So minimum wages are incredible because they do reduce employment. The economic incidence of the minimum wage tends to fall on the consumers of minimum wage produced goods, who themselves tend to be relatively poor. Mm-hmm. So think about who eats at McDonald's. It generally tends to be people from the bottom half of the income distribution. I have a hypothesis that the probability that you say, well, I'd pay an extra 50 cents for a Big Mac if it means that someone earns a living wage, and the probability that you have eaten a Big Mac in the last 10 years is effectively zero.
But not correlated.
Right, yeah. So we reduce employment options and employment opportunities for precisely the people who can least afford it. Mm-hmm. Those on the margins of society. There are reasons why African-American teenage unemployment is multiples of what it is for whites, and a lot of it has to do with not just minimum wages, but other restrictions on the labor market. Mm-hmm. One of the sources we refer to in here is a book by an economist named Thomas Leonard called Illiberal Reformers, that talks about economists and sociologists in the progressive era. And economics hasn't broken, but a lot of economists in the progressive era said, yeah, we should totally have a higher minimum wage so that we can keep members of low wage races, and that's their term, out of the labor market.
Wow.
If we let all of these swarthy immigrants from all of these parts of Southern Europe and the rest of the world that we don't like, if we all let them in, and then if we allow them to work and undercut white wages, then they're going to debauch the genetic stock, and that's a paraphrase of some of the things that they said. And we just simply can't have that. If we let them in, we have to have a high minimum wage so that they can't breed.
Wow.
And we have to have a high minimum wage in order to keep them out of the labor market. So this is something with very, very questionable ethical roots. I'm not sure how or when it became a good idea.
Even if it didn't have those roots, it would still have the effect that you're talking about. So, example nearby, we're just about a mile, I think, from a beautiful building that was built by a Walmart, if I'm not mistaken. It was bustling, but then Oakland decided to jack up the minimum wage, and it just became unviable, and it's closed. So there's this big, beautiful facility not far from here that used to be bustling with goods and employment, and now is sitting there empty.
Yeah,
because people wanted to help the poor, and therefore they were harming the poor.
Well, one of the things that we say in the book is so a lot of you are old enough to remember the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And so we do this thought experiment at the book where we ask, if Joan of Arc showed up, and you had to take Joan of Arc to one place to convince her, to show her how radically different our lives are from the life that she lived. Like what would show the biggest difference? I think the correct answer is a super Walmart. Because it stocked floor to ceiling with goods that she wouldn't have been able to even imagine. But most importantly, it's the clientele at a Walmart supercenter. It generally it's not the descendants of gods and kings. It's not the upper crust. It's not the powdered lords and ladies. They're people from every tribe and tongue and nation and every decile of the income distribution. At Walmart, you don't have to be a member of the party. You don't have to look a certain way. You don't have to talk a certain way. As long as you have the money, Walmart will be more than happy to do business with you.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, it absolutely is. Last summer, we spent about 3 weeks in Copenhagen, Denmark, and so we toured a bunch of castles. And the most remarkable thing about the castles that we toured in Denmark were the tourist toilets. These are the most remarkable things about the castles. I mean, there's pretty like paintings and things like that. But
Are they pay toilets?
They're not. No, not because once you pay for admission to the castle or whatever, you can use the bathroom for free. And it turns out actually, if you sign up for the Westfield Shopping Mall like frequent buyers club, you can use you don't have to pay to use the bathroom at the Westfield Shopping Mall in Paris. So just for anyone,
tuck that away.
Tuck that away for future reference. So I still get occasional emails in French, which I can't read. But you go through these castles and they'll show you the bathroom where, the king of Denmark, or Hamlet did his business. And it's just gross. And then you go to see where the tourists, the descendants of the people that the kings and queens of Denmark ruled, where they get to relieve themselves. And it's a night and day difference. It's incredible when we think about capitalist economic progress. The fact that we have access to indoor plumbing, and everybody practically does, or the fact that we have these cornucopias everywhere where you can go to a Walmart or a Target or a Costco and get enormous amounts of food and electronics and office supplies and clothing and all of this other stuff for ever decreasing amounts of money is really, really remarkable.
There's a really important section in the first third of the book, as I recall, about this basic point, which is that there has been a huge acceleration of prosperity in almost all parts of the world, especially in all those parts where there was some degree of private property, some degree of protection for trade. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Most people think that, capitalism progressively impoverishes societies, but it would seem the opposite is true, and to a great degree.
Yes. So one of our target audiences, I guess, is sort of eschatologically minded conservative evangelicals who are kind of the view that, the world's just got to be getting worse. Like it has to be getting worse because it's got to usher in the end times. It's like, well, look, I'm not sure eschatologically what I believe, but if you look at almost any indicator, it's getting unambiguously better and has been for my entire life. Now, as of the last data I checked, there's about 500 million people in the world who live in extreme poverty, which is 500 million too many. But 500 million out of 8 billion is a lot better than 3 billion out of 4 billion, which is what it was about a generation or a generation and a half ago. I describe this to my students as the greatest story never told, because with the liberalization of China in the late 1970s,
when the Chinese Communist Party relinquished a lot of its actual communist policies for a while.
Right. Yeah. When Deng Xiaoping said, to grow rich is glorious, let's liberalize a bit. The absolute number of people living in extreme poverty started to decrease, even though the world's population, I think it's at least doubled.
And even though they stopped having 10-year and 5-year plans and commissars everywhere.
Yeah. So economic liberalization has been great, and great especially for the poorest people in the world. So its access to markets is, I think, if anything, a moral imperative if we're going to have cider's preferential option for the poor.
Right. This is related to a couple other points in the book where you point on some sort of outlying points like on colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. It is argued by people who used to be on Ron Sider's side of things and others that those three institutions, colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, were the source of the wealth of successful Western countries.
Yeah, and that's an important point. When we think about the title of Sider's book, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, the empirical question we have to ask is, did the richness, did the fact that they're rich Christians, did that cause the hunger? And no, it didn't. when we write about slavery, imperialism, colonialism, these were terrible things that made the world poorer.
The biggest violations of individual liberty you could imagine.
Oh yeah. It's horrific. But they did not make the Western world rich.
Where slavery was widely practiced, did those countries become rich?
They did not. If slavery could have caused a great enrichment, and Deirdre McCloskey and I say this in our 2020 book, if that could have caused a great enrichment, it would have happened a long time ago. It would have happened somewhere else. One of the things that we were talking about Thomas Sowell before the event, I had tracked down his source for this, and he points out, or the source points out, that there were more Europeans captured and sold into slavery along the coast of North Africa than there were Europeans transported to what's now the United States. So, okay, if slavery could create a great enrichment, then why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen in North Africa? Or why were the United States and England the great industrial powers and not Portugal and Brazil? Or why, given that if there's anything that is universal to human history, it's people being horrible to people, why did the great enrichment not happen in some other slave-driven society a long time ago? The historian Neil Ferguson, in writing about colonialism and empire, said that empire was the least original thing Europeans did after 1492. He's exactly right.
And it does seem that where slavery was eliminated and imperialism was finally shed, those were precisely the social places in which the Great Prosperity took off.
Right.
So that they had been actually constraints.
Yes.
Colonialism and slavery had been constraints against prosperity.
Yeah.
And then when they were eliminated, then the prosperity could ensue.
Right. And it's really important to avoid the fallacy of composition in all of this because, yes, imperialism made Cecil Rhodes rich. It made Queen Victoria rich. Slavery made a lot of Southern planters rich, but it did not enrich entire societies.
Society remained weak and relatively poor.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, so some economists who studied this in the late 1960s, well, okay, so I'll talk about two bits of intellectual history here. One on the intellectual history of imperialism. The return on investment in the British Empire was negative. So yes, it enriched some specific people, but it did not enrich the average person in England. It was an economic waste. Similarly, if there were any above normal profits to be had in slavery and the slave trade, they would have accrued to the initial slave catchers on the African interior, who were themselves usually Africans. So, because by that point, after people are captured, then all of the enslaved person's future productivity gets capitalized into the price. So rates of return from that point forward are basically normal. And if there were, again, extra normal profits to be had, they were had primarily by Africans who were capturing other Africans and then selling them to the Europeans on the coast. So the surplus value, such as it was, would have been geographically mislocated. It's not flowing to Europe. It's not flowing to the Americas. And it would have been in Africa.
And the simple summary point for me, at least, is that slavery and colonialism, imperialism, were economic losers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
There's so much more in this book, and we're going to turn to some questions in just a moment. There are things in the book, for example, where you talk about how there's backfiring, that tariffs backfire.
Oh boy.
And they may want to ask about that. And then you talk about things how like price fixing backfires. And you talk about how price gouging laws backfire. There's all sorts of things that seem to be well known, but they just backfire. And it all goes back to your basic point, which I think is that if you want to honor God, you need to honor the way the creation actually functions and honor the persons who bear the image of God, who deserve a freedom that is not afforded to them in tyrannical settings. So let's turn to the audience tonight. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting questions lurking out there. I could just keep going on and on, actually. Like I wanted to ask you about the Cobra effect. But anyway, I could come back to that. So somebody may have a question. Mark, do you have a question by any chance that you might want to ask at this point? No, I'm just calling on you because we talked earlier. Well, here comes the mic. Sure. If you want it.
Oh, one question I had is, this is a book on topics that generally all economists are going to agree on. And, it's kind of funny, especially with friends, younger family members, if I'm trying to maybe persuade somebody about a topic like the minimum wage, it kind of turns out like something you described in your book. I think trying to give up a belief is like losing a limb
Yeah.
with some people. I'm really kind of curious if that's just me or what the effect is when you're teaching students these very basic lessons, when it comes to minimum wage or price gouging, or how much resistance you get on that in the classroom. I know the classroom's a little different environment than, because you're giving those kids a grade.
Right.
But I'm always kind of curious.
Some of the students just don't care. They just want to know what's going to be in the exam and what the right answer is. But there are a lot of students who are a lot. They're fairly open-minded. They're at a time where they're discovering their identity. They're figuring out what they actually believe. They don't cling as tightly, I think, to a lot of ideas as we do when we get older. But there is, and this is one of the things I've found, and anyone else who's taught economics can probably has probably had an experience like this when you say something that is correct, but that refutes someone else's belief, they get angry because they have lost a part of their identity. Like the story they're telling about themselves, it turns out, is incorrect. And that I think is a human flaw that we all have.
Of course, you can still give them credit for good intentions. They're just filtering it through a really bad theory.
Yeah. So I've stopped. I again in my classes I say, like, I want you guys to quit patting yourselves on the back and give yourself credit for good intentions. Because there's a very, very, very good chance that your local service project is just making things worse.
Other question? Here's one. Okay.
While I've lived in the Bay Area for about 10 years, I spent 55 years in the Midwest, in Nebraska.
Okay.
And have many relatives who derive their living from farm price supports.
Yep. Oh, boy.
And, I love the concept of Adam Smith and the invisible hand and all that, but this seems sort of an enigma relative to that. So I welcome here.
Well, it's not an enigma if you just recognize that we're wasting resources and producing a lot of agricultural commodities that we don't need. Politically, it makes sense because people like having higher incomes. When I talk about this in my principles of macro class, I talk about the cheese caves in Kansas and Missouri, which apparently, to the best of my knowledge, you can't tour these. I haven't actually looked in great detail, but the federal government owns and stores 1.4 billion pounds of cheese in caves in Missouri and Kansas because of milk price supports. And what they're doing is wasting resources.
Makes me feel queasy.
It's staggering to think about the resources that are going into storing all this cheese. That they got to do something with all this extra milk that they buy, and they put it in cheese caves. So I want to, at some point, maybe next summer, our big family trip will be to go tour the cheese caves if we can. But yeah, right, yeah. We just did Disney World last week, and okay, whatever. No, yes, Disney World, Universal Studios. No, by God, we're going to the cheese caves next year. The problem is that when people are benefiting handsomely from that, it's really, really hard for them to let go of it. Or when people do something that when you can put a face on something, it becomes really, really easy to run yourself aground in lots and lots of intellectual errors. So I give students a picture of a guy who's an avocado farmer somewhere in Southern California and say, okay, should we have avocado tariffs because they will protect this guy who grows avocados in Southern California? So yeah, we love Jack or whatever his name is. This guy who grows avocados in Southern California, and it's got to be good for the American economy that he has a higher income and can buy stuff for his family. And well, no, because the rest of us are paying more for avocados, and that means that somebody else isn't getting paid, and we have fewer avocados. So anyone who runs a restaurant where you're trying to sell guacamole, well, that's
the benefit.
Fewer avocados for you. Yes,
the cost is dispersed.
Yes. Yeah. The benefits are very highly concentrated, and the benefits are very visible.
Mm-hmm.
usually, but the costs are dispersed.
Which bears on the question of free trade, to be sure. But there might be a question out there on that or other subjects I don't want to miss. There's one back there in the corner. Our microphone is coming your way.
Yeah. I do tell students in the fall term, usually I say, this is how you can ruin Thanksgiving, is to bring this up. So.
Okay, in the back.
Yeah, so you mentioned that some of your student service projects might have unintended externalities and negative consequences. So my question for you is, from a Christian perspective, let's just say someone does have a Christian morality and they believe that they're their brother's keeper, so to speak. What do you think is the best way forward to that? I know in the Bay Area, there's this very common idea of effective altruism, that you should obtain a high income and then donate all of your surplus income to causes that you believe in.
Yeah.
Do you think that also has unintended consequences? Or what do you think, what action-based obligation do people have to the rest of the world from your Christian perspective?
Don't make things worse. I think like first do no harm is a really, really, really good principle. And it's like, okay, great. I'm glad that you meant well, but people died. There's nothing, you're not going to bring them back to life, and your tears or your good intentions are really not going to do much for their loved ones. I'd say first do no harm. Second, try to be as concrete and specific as you can in areas where you kind of really know what's going on. Yeah, effective altruism, I think is fascinating because
That was Sam Bankman-Fried's mantra, right?
I think so. I don't know, but
Yeah, it was.
but yeah, but there are lots of different metrics on, like, here, if you have $1 million, what can you yeah. Right, donate to the Independent Institute, yeah, or like buy malarial bed nets or something like that. What I'm actually coming to believe, and so I've got a paper about this on the work of James M. Buchanan on work and saving, is I think the best way, or one of the best ways to help the world, is just to work a little bit harder and save a little bit more. At the end of every chapter of Mere Economics, we allude to Francis Schaeffer's book, How Now Shall We Live, or How Then Should We Live? I always get that wrong.
How should we then live?
How should we then live? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And give some concrete action steps. And then at the end of the book, we say our philosophy on life now is basically make more, take less. Because there's a lot of local knowledge about the particular circumstances of time and place that we can't have, but we can nonetheless contribute to the solutions of those problems by doing a little bit more of what is in our comparative advantage, and then by consuming a little bit less. So that's my take on it now.
So that was pretty sympathetic to his point about giving money away.
Mm-hmm.
You're not against giving money away.
No, not at all.
You seem to be very in favor of it. Here's a question in the front. Could you bring up the microphone? It's coming your way. There it is.
You mentioned colonialism, and so I just wanted to kind of follow up and clarify the situation with UK and India. As you know, we frequently read that, okay, this impoverished India suppressed its industrial or commercial development, impoverished the people there, and so forth and so on, even though if it enriched individuals in the UK. So is that a correct evaluation that colonialism impoverished the people in India?
I would say that yes, colonialism is bad for the people who were colonialized, or who were colonized, generally, but that doesn't mean it was good for the colonizers. Right. And there is, in a lot of the arguments on empirical economics, the colonizers, a lot of them did horrible things, but they left behind institutions that...
Hospitals, schools.
Well, yeah, things like hospitals and schools, but then also political institutions like property rights and the rule of law that then led to economic growth once they kind of got things situated. The major disasters that happened in India in the 20th century were while India was explicitly socialist. So there's a lot of stuff that happened that you can't blame the British for, and a lot of stuff that happened that you can. But yeah.
Oh, and you talked about Thanksgiving. My brother ruined a Thanksgiving dinner many years ago by mentioning the right to work laws.
Oh boy,
it turned out to be very controversial.
Yeah.
Is there another question? There's one behind you back here, Jeff.
Hi, would you recommend reading or rereading Mere Christianity first before tackling your book?
I would say it's neither necessary nor sufficient. I would definitely say though that just in general, rereading and rereading Mere Christianity is always a good idea. Always worth reading. Yeah, it's always a good idea. If you're familiar with it, then some of the things in our book will make maybe a little bit more sense. But you don't need to have read Mere Christianity any more than you need to have read an economics textbook to get the main idea from Mere Economics.
Here's something you said
Mhm.
that I wanted to ask you. Something. I don't see an immediate question, although you'll have another chance coming in just a moment. Okay? But you said at one point that you were arguing with about free trade, which you support. And you say that trade skeptics overlook the dispersed benefits of free trade. Some find virtue in paying more for fair trade coffee or goods made in America and so forth, local produce. But as Henry Hazlitt reminds us, the art of economics means looking at the costs and benefits for everyone, not just for the highly visible beneficiaries. It's a variation on love your neighbor as yourself. And then you say this, a couple paragraphs later, you recall Matthew 25, which is Christ's parable of the sheep and the goats. And at the last day, Jesus will commend the righteous for feeding him when he was hungry, for clothing him when he was naked, and for visiting him when he was sick. The righteous will be surprised. When did they do any of these things for Jesus? And Matthew 25:40 says, the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. International trade helps you love neighbors whom you may never meet.
Yes.
I've never heard anyone put that parable of the final judgment in connection with international trade. And yet your point is strong.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. One of my lines in my Principles of Economics classes is, the heavens declare the glory of God, and so does the quantity theory of money. And we see this, we see something similar when we're looking at the laws of supply and demand and what happens in an extensive commercial society. What I said earlier about being able to use knowledge you don't have for purposes other people don't know. When you're making more and taking less, you're creating the resources that can then go to feed, clothe, and shelter people on the other side of the planet that you will never know, will never meet, who may not like you if they met you, but with whom nonetheless you're able to cooperate. Just thinking about housing specifically. So you decide to save more. Great. Interest rates go down just a little bit. Okay. Interest rates go down just a little bit, which means that someone somewhere can build another apartment complex, which means that someone somewhere has a roof over their head that they wouldn't otherwise. And that, I think, is the beauty of the social world.
When it operates in this diffuse and liberty-respecting way.
Yeah. Now, I know it being in the Bay Area, talking about building apartment complexes, this is a foreign concept, I think, here.
It's very difficult.
Yes. Yeah. Years ago, you used to be able to build these things called houses and apartments in the Bay Area.
You can still build them, but only the really, really expensive ones.
Yep. Well, that actually raises what I think is another interesting point about unintended consequences. Is if we look at San Francisco specifically, the only kind of housing that really pays is luxury housing. Because if you're going to wait 5 years to clear every review and spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on various things, you got to make sure it pays off. So at the margin, people are substituting toward luxury housing and away from quote unquote affordable housing. So once again, we're hurting exactly the people we claim to be helping.
Right. I think there may be another question somewhere that I'm missing. Yes, there was one in the back. Thank you. Okay. I saw the twinkle in your eye.
Well, talking about minimum wage, one of the earlier ones in the U.S. is prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon.
Yep.
Who, of course, were a Republican senator and a Republican congressman from New York and Pennsylvania. And why was it introduced? Because federal contractors were bringing in blacks from the South, paying them a lot less than the unionized people were earning. and underbidding and winning the contracts. So this was a wonderful protection for the poor. And what it really was, of course, was a welfare program for the rich. And we are seeing that continue to this day in a lot of the organizations that I am active in, where there's one united thing, which is government is really screwing things up, and we've got to figure out how to stop it until we get to the point where somebody has something they're trying to protect. And there has been an amazing outcry among the people in these groups against artificial intelligence because it's going to take the people out of their jobs and ruin their jobs. And one crazy thing about the terrible, low-wage, unsafe, terrible working condition jobs in all these third world and fourth world nations, they don't spend a whole lot of time on recruiting.
Right.
There's a long line of people who want the job. What does that say? So would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, so Milton Friedman once said that every business person believes in free trade and free markets in every industry except for their own, which has to be protected and subsidized as a matter of national security. The problem is that it's if the special privileges are out there, then they're almost overwhelmingly tempting. It's really, really hard to get away from that. So some of the work so Phil Magnus, who should be in this chair but is ill, he and I have written a handful of papers about the political economy of an economist named W.H. Hutt, who is a critic of the South African color bar, and a lot of his work in the first half of the 20th century up through the mid-60s was on exactly this point, which is you had prevailing wage laws, you had all of these restrictions specifically to keep Africans from competing with whites in South Africa. Again, we saw the same thing in the United States during the Progressive Era. The people who were being protected were the ones who were able to convince the ruling elites that, yes, in fact, their interest was really, really special. And it's really easy to say we shouldn't bend to the will of special interests. Legislation shouldn't be for sale, but when it's your ox that's about to be gored, or when it's your interest that's at stake, then suddenly people change. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
Okay. I was going to say to the point earlier, I had a friend in graduate school from was from a farming family in Illinois, and he said he was talking about one Thanksgiving he was sitting and talking to his family, and they said, "What are you learning in grad school in economics?" He said, "Well, markets and blah 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 blah, and we need more free trade." Like, yeah, we totally need more free trade. And we need to get rid of price supports for this thing. Yeah, we need to get rid of price supports for that thing. And we need to quit having price supports for this thing that makes your inputs more expensive. Oh, of course we need to, and we need to get rid of price supports for corn. And then silence. And so all of a sudden people's opinions changed.
This raises a really important question, which may be kind of the last stage of this conversation, which is that you rightly are pointing out here that even though it's clear that it is in the general interest for there to be kind of even-handed rules and no special deals and no special favors from the government and so forth, when it comes down to it, individual special interests are always, they might subscribe to that, but then when it comes to corn or whatever,
right,
we're all so tempted by our self-interest to go against it. But this actually indicates to me that having a free society of the rule of law and private property, which conduces to prosperity and so forth, has an interesting relationship to the concept of self-interest.
Yeah.
Because it turns out, in the example you just gave with the corn thing and other analogous cases, that it turns out that actually an attitude of disinterested benevolence is actually required to sustain this kind of free system. But on the other hand, we're also accustomed to Adam Smith's observation that you quoted in the beginning of your book, that it is not from benevolence of the baker that we expect our bread, and that, in fact, the free system is in some ways fueled by appropriate self-interest. So is self-interest a good thing for a free exchange, free market society, or a bad thing? Is self-interest undermining or sustaining order? Which is it?
So the phrase that Smith uses is own interest. Says you refer to your own interest. It's from their attention to their own interest or their self-love. And the way that I read that passage in Smith, where he says it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, the brewer, they expect your dinner, but from their attention to their own interest, is that the butcher, the baker, and the brewer do not exist for you. They have their own families, they have their own problems, they have their own interests. And while, if you're a 2-year-old, you can stamp into the kitchen and say, Mommy, Daddy, I'm hungry, and expect to be fed, to walk into a restaurant or a butcher shop or something like that, or just expect someone to feed you because you're you is somewhat presumptuous. Because again, the person behind the counter, they've got their own family to feed, they've got their own friends, they've got their own communities to take care of and things like that. So the right way for strangers to interact is by, and the least costly way to do so is by saying, look, you scratch your back and you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Politically, this is where things get a little bit hairy, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the self-interested voter hypothesis, which is that people vote their wallets, is not a very good description of how people actually
their
vote.
ideas.
Yeah.
I think
They vote for what sounds good.
Yeah.
And listen to any campaign. They'll say, we're for good things. It's like, okay, well, great. Okay. It's like your opponent's like, who has ever gotten up in front of an audience and said, you know what, I really want bad things. I'm for bad things. It sounds good to help the farmers in Nebraska. It sounds good to make America great again by having, washing machines made in Indiana or something like that. It sounds good to, just in my industry, higher education, like it sounds good to think about everybody having a great college education and for free, and therefore enormous amounts of money going right into my pocket, frankly. Well, no, going right into a bunch of administrators' pockets, but I'm sure you've had Richard Vedder here to talk about that. That's where that I think is a political problem we haven't solved yet. Is how do we prevent bad ideas from manifesting themselves as policy?
At one point in your book, you quote, I think, St. Paul, the New Testament, from Galatians, where he says, look not only to your own interest, but also to the interest of others, which is a nicely balanced biblical statement.
Yeah.
How does that relate to this?
Yeah, so that's what the butcher, the baker, and the brewer are doing when they're cutting meat and they're baking bread and they're brewing beer, is they're looking to the interests of the person who wants to buy the bread, who wants to buy the meat, who wants to buy the beer,
and
to their own. Yeah. So they are looking after their own interests by also looking after the interest of others. And when I think about if there's a political spin on that verse, it is that when you're thinking about looking out for others' interests, you have to think in terms of what does in fact conduce to the common good, rather than what is good for your special interest.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, kind of borrowing from Milton Friedman, everybody's interest really is special.
So, does the free market system, or capitalism, we call it, is it fueled by selfishness?
Fueled by selfishness? No. I think it's fueled by liberty.
Mm-hmm.
It's fueled by innovation, and it's fueled by people's proper attention to their own interest. Now, what you mentioned about selfishness, there's a classic clip on YouTube you can find where Milton Friedman's arguing with Phil Donahue, and Donahue says, "Do you ever think that maybe greed is not a good system to run on?" And Milton Friedman said, "Well, who do you know who's not greedy? Like everybody's greedy in some form or fashion.
Well, they want what they want.
Right? They want what they want." Occasionally, when you hear about executives doing horrible things, that's not a condemnation of business as much as it's a condemnation of humanity. Mm-hmm. Tyler Cowen in his book on Big Business says business people do bad things not because they're business people, but because they're business people, and people do bad things. Right. So
bureaucrats do bad things too.
So in a world where a certain fraction of the population consists of sociopaths, I would much rather have those sociopaths running banks than leading armies. And there's an alternative world in which Donald Trump is a real estate developer, and not That's all he is. He spends his time being a real estate developer. Or an alternative world in which, you pick anyone who's ever been elected to any public office, where they're doing something different. There's an alternative world where maybe there was no political power, where Joseph Stalin finished seminary, or where Mao Zedong became a farmer and didn't butcher tens of millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think is one of the best defenses of the free market. Is it turns even the worst of those among us
Yes.
toward other people's benefits.
It works best of all when people have good intentions and follow what's morally right.
Right.
But even when they don't and they tend toward selfishness, the competition of the free market and the price system tends to corral even bad selfishness.
Yeah.
I wonder whether that's not a providential arrangement of God to help human beings in the fallen condition of things that we live in, that things are best when people are good. But at least in a free society, even when they're bad and selfish, they're kind of corralled into fostering such things. Right. They have to interact with others voluntarily. So maybe God is merciful in allowing the spontaneous order of the free market.
Yes, absolutely.
With that, we could probably stop. And I will turn back to my colleague, Mary Thoreau, to say goodbye to us.
Well, I just want to thank you again, Art, for coming.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you, Graham, for stepping in at the 11th hour. Thank you all for being here. We hope you'll join us the next time.
All right.